All right, everyone. We're diving into a topic a bunch of you have been asking about lately, Mpox.
Hmm.
And I get it. We all saw those headlines last year, and then it kind of felt like, okay, is it gone? Is it not?
Right.
But you guys are right to want the deeper story here, because what we're seeing in 2024 is, well, it's not just a rerun of 2022, is it?
Not even close, no. In fact, we've actually got two different outbreak situations happening right now. Kind of like two sides of the same coin, both really important to understand.
Two outbreaks, two different
Hmm.
stories. Okay, see, this is why you guys wanted a deep dive on this. But before we get there, just a quick refresher. For anyone who might have missed the initial wave of news last year, what exactly is Mpox? I feel like I have the gist, but I'm sure you can explain it way better.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mpox, it's a viral illness, and while it's usually a lot milder, you can kind of think of it as a distant relative of smallpox. The real hallmark is this distinctive rash, often with these fluid-filled
Yeah,
blisters.
those are kind of hard to miss.
Yeah, exactly. But along with the rash, you can also get those familiar flu-like symptoms, fever, aches, chills, that whole thing.
Usual suspects. So
Yep.
basically, sounds like you definitely don't want to get it,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily like the worst thing ever if you do, right?
Yeah.
Or am I being too naive?
Well, you're right that most people do recover fully. Both the World Health Organization and some recent Wikipedia stuff I was looking at, they both emphasize that. And it's a big but, it can be very serious, especially for young kids, pregnant women, anyone with a weakened immune system, that sort of thing.
Okay, so definitely not something to just brush off then, even if it's not always like, front page news every day. It's interesting though, right? Because we often think of these outbreaks as these sudden events, but you were saying Mpox has actually been around for a while.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's not new at all, actually. The virus itself, it was first discovered back in 1958.
58, wow.
Yeah, in monkeys, hence the name. But it wasn't until 1970 that we saw the first human case. Since then, it's kind of been this background concern, mostly in parts of Central and Southern Africa. It's considered endemic there.
Endemic, meaning it's just always kind of there.
Exactly. Consistently present, yep. Which actually plays a big part in why the current situation is so complex. But we'll get into those two outbreaks we keep mentioning in a bit.
Ugh, you're killing me with the suspense already. Okay, okay, before we break down the outbreaks themselves, how does this thing even spread? I always hear close contact, but that feels kind of vague, or like, what does that even mean in real life?
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. Close contact, it can mean a lot of things. In this context, it usually means direct contact with the rash itself, any bodily fluids from someone who's infected.
Okay, so we're talking like kissing, sexual contact, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. But it's not just that. It can also spread through things like bedding, clothing, towels, anything that's been contaminated.
Yeah,
Oh, and here's where it gets even more interesting. Animals are part of the equation, too.
right. I mean, it came from monkeys originally, right?
Yeah.
We're talking like household pets now, or?
It's a whole range, actually. Scientists are still figuring out exactly which animals are the most involved, but we know certain rodents in Africa play a role, and there have been some unusual cases in other parts of the world. Remember that outbreak in the U.S. back in 2003?
Vaguely, wasn't it something about exotic pets?
It was prairie dogs. They got infected from some imported rodents, and it kind of snowballed from there.
Prairie dogs. Wild.
Yeah, it was a whole thing. And get this, even more recently, a domestic dog got Mpox. Probably from its owners, but still. So while that big 2022 outbreak that was mainly through sexual contact, it's really important to remember it's not exclusively an STI. That's actually really important for understanding these different outbreaks, but we'll get to that.
This is what I mean about going beyond the headlines, right? Like, it's easy to think you know what's up, and then you're like, wait, prairie dogs. Okay, so you get exposed. Somehow, however it happens, what are the symptoms someone should actually be, looking out for? We've got the rash, the fever, anything else. What should people actually, be aware of?
So the rash itself is actually fascinating. A lot of people describe it as, this very distinctive thing, fluid-filled blisters, which, yeah, often true, but where it shows up on the body, that can be all over the map. Some people, they get that classic widespread rash, head to toe, but others might just have a single sore. And, imagine trying to connect that to Mpox if you're not even thinking about it.
Just one sore. Oh, wow. Yeah, I wouldn't even know what to think if I saw that.
Exactly. It's one of those things that makes raising awareness even more important. And then, on top of that initial, rash, fever, all that, there are also potential complications.
Oh, right, right.
Most people bounce back fine, don't get me wrong, but Mpox, it can lead to these secondary infections, pneumonia. Some people even experience vision loss in really severe cases.
Vision loss. Okay, now that definitely sounds a lot more serious than just a few itchy bumps.
No, you're right. There was even a case mentioned in the WHO research. Corneal infection ended up with the person losing their sight. And this is actually where those two outbreaks we keep mentioning, this is where that really becomes crucial. Because, see, the severity of Mpox, even how the virus itself actually presents, it can be totally different depending on which type of Mpox virus we're even talking about.
Okay, two outbreaks, potentially different symptoms. This is already getting complicated. All right, so we've got these two separate outbreaks you keep mentioning, potentially with different symptoms even, different levels of severity. Can you, unpack that a bit? Where are these outbreaks actually happening, and what makes them so different from each other?
Yeah, so it really is like two sides of the same coin, like I was saying. On the one hand, you've got what's happening in parts of Central and Southern Africa.
Okay.
Mpox has been endemic there, like we talked about, for decades now. And that's mainly driven by a type of the virus called clade I.
Clade I. Wait, is that what we were dealing with last year during that big global outbreak?
Good memory. So that global outbreak, that was almost entirely a different clade I. And it's generally like way milder than what we're seeing with clade I.
Okay, so two different clades, two totally different scenarios playing out. Got it. So what's the situation like right now in those African countries then with clade I?
It's really complicated. There are actually multiple subclades within clade I.
Oh, great. Even more clades.
Right. It's a lot to keep track of. But basically, these subclades, they're all kind of circulating in different parts of Central and Southern Africa. And the fatality rate for clade I, it can be as high as 4 to 5% in some of these outbreaks.
4 to 5%. Whoa. Okay, that's definitely not how most people were talking about it last year, at all.
No, it's a completely different ballgame. And honestly, those numbers, they're probably even higher in reality.
Really?
Yeah, because a lot of these regions, they have really limited healthcare access, so underreporting is a huge issue.
Ah, that makes sense, yeah.
And tragically, it's the kids who are really bearing the brunt of it. Like we were saying before, those complications, they're way more susceptible to serious illness from clade tech.
Man, this is what I mean about, really going beyond the headlines. It's easy to forget there's this whole other side to the story happening.
Absolutely. And it gets even more, I guess, unsettling is the word.
Yeah.
Because there's also now this new variant of clade tech that's popped up recently.
Oh, fantastic. A new variant.
Yeah, and this one, it's harder to detect with the standard tests, which is not ideal.
Not ideal at all.
It's spread to new areas within Africa already, and there's even early evidence that suggests it might be more easily transmitted through sexual contact, which hasn't really been a major factor in those African outbreaks before.
Wait, so not only is the virus itself way more serious in those outbreaks, but now it might be spreading more easily, too.
That's the concern, yeah. And it's actually a big part of why the WHO, they declared Mpox a public health emergency of international concern again.
They did. Wait, hold on. Again.
Yeah, so they did it once back in 2022 when that whole global outbreak was at its peak, and then they just did it again recently in August 2024, largely because of this new variant.
Wow, I totally missed that. I had no idea they declared another global health emergency.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't. It didn't really make the same kind of splash in the news this time around.
Which is, I guess, why we're doing this whole deep dive.
Exactly. It just goes to show, even if things seem calmer here in, say, Europe or North America, it's definitely not over. And this new variant, it just raises all these questions about whether we could see, a resurgence of this more dangerous clade ovary, even in places where it hasn't really been a huge issue before.
Okay, so that's a lot to process.
Mm-hmm.
Two different outbreaks, two different clades, two very different levels of concern even. Let's maybe switch gears slightly and talk about that other side of the coin for a second. We keep saying global outbreak, but what does that even look like in 2024?
Yeah.
My understanding is things have kind of calmed down since last year, right?
You're right, they have. So the situation globally outside of those African countries we were just talking about, it's very different. That big outbreak that we all heard about in 2022, the one driven by the milder clade irby, it has really died down in most of the world.
Okay. So then why even declare another global health emergency if things are calmer now? Is it just all about this new variant in Africa, or is there more to it?
That's a big part of it, for sure. The WHO, they're definitely worried about the potential for this new variant to spread beyond Africa. Viruses don't exactly respect borders, But it's also because even though the case numbers are way down from their peak clade I transmission, it is still happening globally, just at much lower levels. So it's more like They're trying to stay ahead of the curve this time, prevent another huge outbreak like we saw before.
So basically 2 outbreaks, 2 different clades, both with their own whole set of challenges. Makes sense, I guess. It just seems crazy to me how much difference there is between these 2 clades. Like how can they even be called the same thing if they're so different?
That's the thing about viruses. They're tricky. And it all comes down to these tiny genetic variations. When we talk about different clades, that's what we're really talking about. It's kind of like imagine looking at a family tree, but for viruses.
A family tree for viruses. Okay, I kind of get it.
And even these really tiny genetic differences, they can make a huge difference in how the virus actually behaves, like how severe it is, how easily it spreads, all of that.
So with cladi and amibia, they might look basically the same under a microscope, but genetically they're different enough to be causing these totally different outbreaks with totally different risks even.
Exactly. And that's why understanding those differences is so important. It's not just about scientific curiosity, it's about knowing how to actually deal with this thing. For example, one theory about why cladi is so much more severe, scientists think it might be linked to higher viral loads in infected people.
Higher viral load meaning?
Basically, the amount of virus in your system. So,
Yeah.
imagine your body encounters this massive army of the virus right off the bat. It's going to be much harder for your immune system to fight it off effectively.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that could also be why we're seeing those more serious complications with cladi, right? Like that vision loss case we were talking about.
It's definitely possible, yeah. Scientists are still, really trying to figure out exactly how these different clades interact with the human body and why we see such drastic differences.
Okay, so what about treatment then? Let's say someone does get Mpox. What happens then? Are there medicines they can take, or is it more cross your fingers and hope for the best?
So the good news is that for most cases, especially those caused by the milder clade IB, it actually resolves on its own.
Really?
Yeah, with rest and what doctors call supportive care.
Supportive care, so keeping hydrated, bringing down the fever, that kind of thing.
Exactly, just making sure the person is comfortable and giving their body the best chance to fight it off. There are some antiviral drugs that are being researched right now that might be helpful, but they're not a guaranteed fix or anything. More research is definitely needed. And then, of course, even once those treatments are available, there's the whole issue of access.
Right, especially in those parts of the world where the healthcare systems are already struggling. And it just highlights how complicated this whole thing is, doesn't it? It's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Anything else we should touch on before we wrap up? Any final thoughts, words of wisdom for our listeners who are probably trying to absorb all this and make sense of it?
If people take away just a couple things from this whole conversation, I think the most important ones are, first, Mpox is still a big deal. It's still a serious public health concern, even if it's not, constantly in the headlines anymore.
Right. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say.
And second, understanding that we're dealing with these 2 very distinct situations, these 2 different outbreaks, each with their own unique challenges, that is key to really wrapping your head around what's going on with Mpox right now.
It's about going beyond those surface level headlines and getting into the nuances.
Exactly.
Okay, so knowing all this about the different clades, this new variant, outbreaks happening in different parts of the world, it can feel kind of overwhelming, honestly.
It's a lot to process, yeah. But remember, knowledge is power, right?
Right. So let's talk about what people can actually do. Knowing about the virus is one thing, but what about protection, treatment, that kind of stuff?
Exactly. So let's start with the most practical thing, vaccines.
Okay.
The good news is we do actually have vaccines that work against Mpox. Both the World Health Organization and that Wikipedia article you sent, they both talk about this. And we even have some newer ones that are specifically designed for Mpox, which is great.
Okay, that's good news.
Yeah.
Although I feel like there's always a but coming with these things.
Right. Well, yeah. Access is still a huge issue. Even when we have these really effective vaccines, actually getting them to the people who need them most, especially in parts of the world where, the healthcare systems just aren't as developed, that's the challenge.
Right. It's that whole thing. A vaccine in a vial doesn't really help anyone, right?
Exactly. And with Mpox, it's even more complicated because we're talking about these 2 different outbreaks, each with their own, set of priorities. In those African countries where clade is the main issue and where it's hitting kids especially hard, vaccination efforts are crucial.
Yeah, that's
But again, it takes resources, infrastructure, global cooperation, all of that to actually get those vaccines to where they need to be.
So it's not just about developing the vaccine itself. It's about making sure everyone can actually get it.
100%. But there are some positive developments, I will say. The WHO is really pushing for wider vaccine availability globally, especially now with these new outbreaks and this whole question mark around this new variant.
Okay, so that's encouraging at least.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that, advocating for better access to healthcare, accurate information, all of that, it really can make a difference.
Absolutely. Okay, so what about treatment then? Like, let's say someone does get Mpox, what happens? Are there medicines they can take, or is it more of a, like, wait-and-see kind of thing?
So most cases, particularly those caused by clade, the milder one, they actually resolve on their own.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, with just rest and what doctors call supportive care.
Which basically means,
So think like fluids, treating the fever, just general stuff to make the person comfortable and give their body a chance to fight it off.
okay, so basically just helping their own immune system do its thing.
Exactly. Now, there are some antiviral drugs being studied that might be helpful, but they're not like a magic bullet yet. Still a lot of research to be done there. And then, of course, even if we do have effective treatments, there's that whole access issue again.
Right, right. Okay, so really it's kind of two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having the tools and knowledge is one thing, but making sure everyone can actually benefit from them, that's the ongoing challenge. Man, it's complicated.
It really is. But like we keep saying, that's why these deep dives are so important.
100%. All right, so we've covered a ton of ground here today. Any last words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap up this Mpox deep dive?
If there's one thing I really want people to take away from this, it's that Mpox is still a serious public health issue, even if it's not, dominating the headlines every day. And we're not just talking about one outbreak here, but two, each with its own set of challenges.
Two outbreaks, two different viruses, two very different situations on the ground.
Uh,
It's all about understanding those nuances, right?
exactly. And that's where amazing listeners come in. Because staying informed, asking questions, and knowing the facts, that's how we fight misinformation and actually make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
You heard it here, folks. Stay curious, stay informed, and hey, maybe you'll even impress someone with your Mpox knowledge at your next social gathering.
Just make sure to cite your sources.
Always. All right, everyone, that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.